Let's imagine that I'm a real estate agent. I'm trying to sell you this flat or apartment, ensuring that it's in flawless conditions and needs no renovation work. You might trust me, sign the contract, and happily buy the place, or, if you're really picky, you might decide to examine it with a black light or UV lamp. In this case, what would you find out? When inspecting this apartment with a black light or UV lamp, also known as Wood's lamp, you would discover that the wood floor was damaged and has been reconditioned with a rough job. At that point, you could probably either choose to look somewhere else or renegotiate the seller's initial asking price. The same can happen when buying a used guitar. Sadly, in the last years, the risk of fraud has dramatically risen. In fact, someone sarcastically said that the number of vintage guitars in the last few years has increased. This means that there are so many fakes or forgeries around, and some of them can even fool the most seasoned and skilled of experts. Forgeries are not the only threat when buying a used guitar. Some seller, whether in good conscience or not, might fail to disclose that the instrument suffered breaks, had repairs, modifications, and restorations, had non-original parts, or might have been entirely or in part refinished. Just think, for example, of the thousands of guitars that since the 80s were routed for Floyd Rose or color vibrato systems, or for DiMarzio humbuckers, and were restored to original specs in the following years. All these issues are not necessarily deal breakers, but all of them definitely affect the market value or selling price of the instrument. In every case, that is something that every buyer would be interested to know before closing a transaction. Likely, when buying a used guitar, we can count on a precious partner, the black light. A few questions could arise. Is there any particular recommended model or type? How is it used? What do I have to look for? What can the UV lamp actually reveal or prove? Let's shed some light on the black light. The point of a black lamp is a filter that blocks most visible light and allows through UV only. Filtered UV lamps are commonly used for decorative or stage lighting effects, disinfection or sterilization, banknotes authentication, and pet urine or scorpion detection. In our case, we want to observe fluorescence, the colored glow that some surfaces or parts emit when exposed to UV. The offer ranges from cheap battery-powered portable flashlights to bigger and more sophisticated fluorescent or LED lamps. To choose the type that suits your needs, just ask yourself a few simple questions. Do I need a handheld portable lamp or a more professional, stable installation? Do I need to shoot photos? Is it sufficient for me to illuminate small details, or do I need to cover the whole guitar at the same time? The main problem with smaller, cheaper lamps is that they don't filter out perfectly the normal visible light, so they are less reliable and can provide uniform illumination. For this reason, I just bought a long black fluorescent tube in a standard plug-in fixture. The shop guys mentioned that this is an old leftover product that has now been replaced by LED lights, but am I a hopeless vintage enthusiast? We will start examining the two vintage Gibson Les Paul Deluxe models we saw in the last episode. I mentioned that this awesome Deluxe from 1970, which belongs to my friend Giacomo Bagorda, is all original. Let's see if the black light can prove I told you the truth. I'm using still photographs rather than video shootings, as under black light I can show you much more defined images. When turning out the lights and switching on the UV lamp, we see that the whole guitar emits a brilliant greenish glow, which lights up evenly and seamlessly the top finished in gold, the headstock finished in black, the back of the body and neck finished with clear coat, and all the plastic parts. This definitely tends to demonstrate and confirm that no modification was made to this guitar since it came out of the Gibson factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1970. On the contrary, in the last episode I mentioned that this 1969 Deluxe from my friend Carlo was refinished in the late 70s. Let's see how it behaves under the black light. As we can see, even if this Les Paul is about as old as the other, the finish of this body emits a considerably dimmer glow. Also, the body has a dimmer glow than the neck. This means that the UV light reveals that the neck and the body were refinished at different times. In this case, probably, when the body was refinished, the original finish of the neck was preserved. The headstock presents more noticeable differences. On Giacomo's Deluxe, the Les Paul logo is absolutely evident through the original finish, while doesn't show correctly through the non-original paint of the refinished guitar. Also, you can see that the border of the refinished headstock clearly shows traces of a non-original layer of clear coat. Interestingly, on the refinished Deluxe conversion, the black light helps us to authenticate the serial number. It reveals the letter A after the usual 6 digits. This is typical of 1970 Gibson serial numbers, so this letter A locates the date of manufacture more exactly in very early 1970, although, as shown in my last episode, the guitar still presents 1969 features. This Gibson Les Paul Vast Custom Shop 1954 reissue is 12 years old. The original finish emits some glowing, although not as lively as on the vintage Gold Top Deluxe. Still, it's interesting to note that the Les Paul logo doesn't show up through Gibson's modern nitro finish. Same for the serial number on the back of the headstock. Comparing plastic parts can be particularly interesting. In this picture, we have 3 covers of P90 soap bar pickups of Les Paul, respectively from 1952, 1968 and a contemporary reissue from 2008. They react very differently to black light. Likewise, when comparing pickguards, the pickguard above, lying on top of the strings, is a contemporary reissue, while the one below, mounted on the guitar, is an original vintage pickguard from the 50s. The original pickguard brightens while the reissue remains dark. The same happens with the trapezoid inlays. In BTR number 2, I told you that this guitar is a custom shop reissue and it was upgraded with original pickups and parts from the 50s. Now you can rest assured that your Bob told you the truth. So, these 3 pickup covers are all from 1952. Nevertheless, please note that the spare P90 cover in the middle is not perfectly identical to those mounted on the guitar. This is because they have about 70 years of two different histories, which means different exposition to the light, environmental factors and players' wear. On both vintage deluxe models, the knobs glow brightly, which indicates that they are vintage originals. In fact, the knobs on the contemporary reissue remain completely dark. On the contrary, on my vintage original 1956 Les Paul Special, the knobs glow intensely. Unlike the new reissues, the Les Paul logo is clearly visible, as is the serial number. The UV lamp could help us detect traces of the past history of the instrument. For instance, we see more clearly the imprint left by a removed Bigsby tailpiece. I even discovered that this guitar had for years a small sticker on the headstock. With some research, I could maybe guess what it was. That probably was the 80s logo of an American wrestling TV show. That's why police detectives use a wood lamp. The guitar also shows how players' wear can be clearly evaluated under black light. The more worn areas generally tend to appear darker, as also shown by the original neck finish on this awesome 1967 Telecaster. This guitar has its original, very rare and precious vintage tortoise pickguard. A friend of mine was skeptical about its originality. Now he can't believe me. The player's wear on an authentic vintage Fender maple neck from the 50s under black light can be even spectacular. The golden transition logo of this 1966 Telecaster has lost all its gold pigment. A potential buyer could argue its originality, but not under black light. If you are planning to spend a few grands on an original PAF or other vintage Gibson pickups, it could be a good idea to ask the seller a picture of the label with the UV lamp. What can we learn from this quick overview? From the wood lamp, we can get a lot of useful information, but we have to be careful, as it could be easily misinterpreted. Unfortunately, there are no absolute rules or surefire formulas for a unique or correct interpretation. We can only take some general guidelines. The rule of thumb is that refinished guitars or reissues don't glow. Any areas of refinish might look darker, but we have to be careful, because as does the wear through the old nitro finish. Some original vintage plastic parts also generally tend to glow brightly. Some flaws or issues will result obvious. Others will be much less obvious and require a trained eye to spot or identify correctly. In fact, the glowing depends on many factors like exposition to daylight, environment, degree of wear, and type of material or paint used. Some people swear that some original vintage guitars kept for years in the case under a bed don't glow significantly. On the other hand, a refinishing job done 20 years ago might react to black light with bright fluorescence, just like an older vintage guitar would. In fact, in general, a guitar that has been played and used a lot tends to show a more intense glow than one always kept in a case. Also, we will never be too careful, as counterfeiters can fraudulently reproduce finishes that simulate the action of time and seem authentic under black light. Furthermore, some fakes will tend to look even more authentic as they age naturally in the next future. Bottom line, the wood lamp cannot be used to determine the age of an instrument with absolute certainty. And unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily prove a guitar's authenticity. It cannot be considered the ultimate secret weapon to spot non-original guitars or parts. Yet the blacklight is a precious, useful tool, definitely worth using. It's especially great to detect repairs, restorations, partial refinish or overspray work, inconsistencies or other finish anomalies such as touch-ups or little cracks. Don't hesitate to let me know any opinion and impression in the comments below or in our Facebook group. To keep in touch, check out our Instagram profile and take a moment to subscribe the BTR channel and hit the bell to keep posted about the next episodes.